An alternate title for the sermon could be "With the Faith of a Coffee Bean." I'm a coffee drinker. My grandpa, when we were young, he used to reward us. He would say that the first person to fall asleep would get a teaspoon of his coffee in the morning. And so we would rush upstairs to fall asleep, and then in the morning we would debate it. We would argue the point and say, "Well, I fell asleep first." "Well, how do you know?" "Because after I fell asleep, I heard you talking." Stuff like that, which was really entertaining for him. And so somehow he'd make a determination, and Grandpa liked his coffee light and sweet. With 2 things of cream and 2 or 3 spoonfuls of sugar in it, and it tasted like melted coffee ice cream to me. Loved it. Now, as I grew, coffee became this thing just to stave off sleep deprivation, right? Or just to help you kind of wake up in the morning. It wasn't anything that I actually enjoyed. It was a thing that I did. And then there was a day when I was staying in a refugee camp in Chiapas, Mexico. And in this refugee camp, these people had lost their homes during the Zapatista uprising of 1993, and they had been chased out of there over the mountains to this place where they could feel that they were safe, and they had lost all of their land. And so each person had a small parcel of land. On it, they grew a little bit of corn, and they grew coffee beans, and they raised chickens. And this provided the food for their diet. And I had a cup of coffee that morning from freshly picked red, ripe coffee beans that was so sweet, naturally sweet, and so strong and so delicious that my purpose for drinking coffee changed forever. And now I'm trying to find and recreate that one perfect cup that I had served to me by Hermelindo Sanchez Sr. in his home that he built with a chainsaw from the trees in the woods around him. It was delicious. Now my parents, they don't drink coffee, they drink tea. My dad still loves a cup of tea. And they started off just like everybody else. If you're going to drink tea, what do you go get at the store? What's the brand? Yeah, probably Lipton, right? You get your Lipton tea, and then you make the stuff. Now, being frugal, they would use the tea bag over and over and over and over again until no amount of dipping it in the water made any difference whatsoever. And then they might try to get one more cup out of it. They would share the tea bag and try to get 4 cups out of each tea bag. And it was always with piping hot water. It wasn't until later that Mom discovered sun tea, where you take the water and you put it in a jar and you put about 10 tea bags in it and you set it out in the sun all day long. And it cold brews, which is something different. Some friends gave them an infuser, and that's when they started to have fun. That's when they started to add things that they thought might taste good, like little cloves they'd put in there along with their tea, or Mom would scrape off the zest of an orange or of a lemon or of a lime and mix that in with the tea. And then somebody told them about the G.H. Ford Tea Company, one of the oldest tea companies in the country, which was located just up and off the road of Poughkeepsie, and they would take weekly pilgrimages up to the G.H. Ford Tea Company, and the door would open and they'd be hit with all those smells, all those wonderful aromas of all these teas from all over the world, and they started to bring home orange teas and lemon teas and raspberry teas and mint teas and Earl Grey and chamomile and all this stuff until the cupboards were full, which made Dad design a tea box out of different woods that he has been making and gifting to people for decades now. He's even sold 1 or 2. Now, coffee and tea have this in common. Well, they come from plants, right? And the leaves, the beans, they've got to be harvested. And then one way or another, they've got to be dried out. Tea leaves are dried out just by laying them out in the sun. And coffee beans are dried out by roasting. And then they've got to be broken down so that their flavor can be extracted through water. And that whole process takes time. Certainly, there are faster ways to make coffee, and there are faster ways to make tea with artificial flavors. And I could tell you the story about when I was so desperate for coffee in college that I skipped the brewing part and I just put the instant coffee in my mouth. But that would be a gross story to tell you, and I wouldn't want to tell you any more than that. The coffee and the tea, you pour the hot water over it, and it just takes time. It takes time to grow the plant. And it takes time to harvest, and it takes time to dry it, and it takes time for it to be properly broken and ground, and it takes time to heat the water and to extract the flavor so that it can be poured out for another person's enjoyment. And man, if that doesn't sound like discipleship to me. Discipleship takes time. First of all, God already picked you. You've already been picked, right? And it takes time for your faith, for yourself to mature to a point that you're willing to give yourself over to this process of being broken and then being poured out for the benefit of somebody else. And that is, I think, what the goal of discipleship is. It's to get to a point in maturity so that we are willing to be broken and to be poured out for the benefit of somebody else. Now, a lot of churches, I'm not saying it's true of this church, but a lot of churches, they don't really have discipleship goals or discipleship process. What a lot of churches will have instead are programs that they hope will attract people and keep them coming, things that will keep people interested, but it's something that plays into the consumerist mindset of Christianity. That idea that you here are the audience, the consumers, and that I am the provider of this thing, and Greg is a provider as well, and if I don't preach well, and if he doesn't play well, and if the choir doesn't sing well, then maybe the whole thing isn't good enough for us, and we're going to go consume somewhere else. That's a consumerist model of Christianity. A discipleship model of Christianity recognizes that you are the performers, and God is the audience. And I'm only here to remind you of your lines. You see the difference? But in a consumerist model, you develop a program and then another program and another program, trying to hook people and get them to come and keep participating so that they won't leave. A discipleship model is instead rooted in covenant. Rooted in covenant ends at the baptismal font, where we pledge ourselves to one another, where we say that we will care for each other throughout the whole of life, where we will speak words of encouragement prophetically to each other, where we will celebrate the gifts and the beauty in each other. And we will be faithful to the fellowship. And here I really am preaching to the choir, aren't I? Aren't I already preaching to the people who understand this? So a discipleship model, it takes time to raise a person to the point where she is willing to give herself over to God and trust that when God breaks her, it's for the better. Was there a person in your life who either said or encouraged you along this line. It may feel like a risk to follow Jesus, but it is the safest place and most secure place to be, is following the Lord. Have you ever heard anything like that from somebody? Have you ever faced a time where you're looking at a hard choice between this or that? And somebody comes to you and says, but if you're taking a risk for Jesus, you're going to be just fine. And it'll be okay. It takes maturity, it takes a bit of persistence, it takes somebody walking alongside of you to encourage you to get to the point of being willing to be broken and being willing to be poured out for the benefit of others. I have this dear friend whose pathway to Christ was not your normal pathway to come to understand who Jesus is. Now, for most people, that normal pathway is through their church or through a retreat that they went on as a youth, or maybe it's through the modeling of their parents or the modeling of somebody else significant within their life. Now, for her, though, even though she'd been to church and she'd heard all the stories, she never really made that connection. You know what I mean? Never really made that connection between the stories she was hearing and the God that she was hearing them about. And she was a voracious reader, and she has this amazing intellectual mind. And she was reading, and her first encounter with Christ, not just academically or intellectually, but her first encounter with Christ was in the character of Aslan, the lion, from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series by C.S. Lewis. And when she encountered, you all remember that story, right? And I hope that you do, because when she encountered that, she saw in that metaphor that Lewis was drawing out about who Aslan is. Everything clicked for her. It all made sense. This idea that love is stronger than death. This idea that resurrection comes through the breath of the one who is resurrected. The idea that you give yourself and follow this one who is righteous and acting in love. All of this made sense to her, and she started to dedicate her life to living into that model that Jesus provided. And she is such a disciple. She is so willing to be broken over and over and over and over again in order to be poured out for the benefit of others. And it's beautiful. How have you been broken? In what way does God want to pour you out for the benefit of others? Or how is God already doing that? Can I talk about Doris a second? That's really a question for you, Doris. I'm asking permission. All right? Yeah. No, don't be worried. Don't be worried. Doris, you are one who allows yourself to be broken and to be poured out. I see that in you. I see that when we come together on Wednesdays and when we're reading our Bibles and holding them up against the events of the week and the questions that you ask that are so insightful. Ones that are not questions meant to draw you to comfort, but to bring a little bit of a prick with them. They bring a little bit of a nudge, a little bit of a to get you. Because you understand that there's something about our faith that is constantly moving us off of our comfort zone. And the way that you pour yourself out for your family, for Bambi, for Josh, for Elise, for all your grandchildren, for Tom, particularly for Kara. and the way you pour yourself out through the vulnerability that you share at the Bible studies. It's discipleship. She hasn't looked at me once. I only chose her because she's closest, and I usually pick on Barbara. But I could probably sit in front of each of you and point out to you how God has broken you and how God is pouring you out. Now, for our church to develop that kind of discipleship that people throughout the whole, I imagine that it's going to mean some willingness to be broken, and it will be. And I imagine that it will mean a willingness to be for others, and I don't know what that means or who they are. All I need to know to get it started is that you're willing to trust in the one who leads you. You're willing to trust Jesus calling you to allow these things to be broken and to allow the beauty of ourselves to be poured out. And if you're willing to do that, then we can start. And I believe that the place where we start is with that book that I've been hawking in front of you for weeks. I don't get a cut of the sales, I promise. For us to come together and to let these voices from another community speak into our own and ask us questions that we've never considered before. And then let the Spirit be at work as we share those answers. Because we, being Presbyterians, believe that grace comes through community, not through an educated leader alone, but that the grace of God is best metered through community. And so those of you who understand that discipleship is like being like a tea leaf or a coffee bean, sign up and let's have a conversation. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, we don't know what it is that needs to be broken, how it is we will be poured out, or for whom. But we trust you. And so we are willing.